Then once they've learnt to point to the barbecue shapes, I'm going to have two things. So I might have barbecue shapes and tiny teddies, or I might have barbecue shapes and an apple, depending on the child's ability to make choices. I wouldn't have two things they love at first. I would have something they love and something they don't like. I like to start with food because normally they're very motivated, but also food normally happens a few times a day. So in the morning, you might show Wheat Bix and Nutri-Grain. You might show an apple drink or milk, water or apple juice. Now, you might be going, Sue, they don't drink apple juice. That's the point. If you've got to have something they like and something they don't like, so they have to choose to point, because they need to learn to choose to know what to point to. Otherwise, they're going to be dragging you around and you won't know what they want because they don't know how to indicate what they want. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Sue Larkey podcast. As I always say, you have to embrace difference to make a difference. Let's dive into today's podcast. Well, welcome everybody. This podcast is really for people working with young children with autism, or if you're working with any children who have limited communication, this is a very important podcast. In my book, The Early Years, I have specifically made it spiral bound because what I have found in the early years, so often people are overwhelmed. There is so much we could be doing, but it's hard to know where to start and what to do. So I think it's very important in the early years we don't overwhelm the child, the family, the carers, the early childhood educators. I mean, I go into preschools and there's like 20 kids, it's really hard to know how to have time to work with a child and what to do. So this podcast is really about the first two things I would work on if the child doesn't already have the skills. And it's teaching to point and asking for help. So much behavior comes from not being able to request, not being able to let people know what the child wants, but also not knowing how to ask for help. Imagine the frustration. So for me, they're the two key things I'd start with. But can I ask in the early years, and if you have my early years book, it is spiral bound. The idea is that you choose two things at a time. So I'm choosing pointing and asking for help. You might choose sitting on the mat and waiting for a turn. Just choose two things. The book is spiral bound, so you can photocopy those pages or take a photo, whatever you want to do. But the idea is the book is opened up a lot and most binding falls to bits. And I wanted a book that was really easy to photocopy or take photos of or share the information so you all work on the same page. Choose your two goals. If it's sitting and waiting, choose those goals, highlight the strategies you're using, but make sure you do them across all settings. So if you're teaching a child or your goal is for a child to sit, then when they go to occupational therapy, find out from the occupational therapist, do they need something weighted or something in their hands to sit? Find out what do they need sensory-wise to help them sit? Are they best to be taught to sit in a chair or on the floor? What are our goals? How are we teaching them to sit? There are so many ways to sit. There's to sit in a chair. There's to sit on the floor. There's to sit on the carpet, to sit on cold concrete. There's so many ways to sit. So anyway, have a think about that. There's sitting on a bench seat outside to eat sometimes in a preschool compared to sitting at a chair at a table. Very different. So just notice. Okay, so say we're teaching a child to sit. Let's just take that one. So we'd get the occupational therapist to think about the actual physicality of seating. And, some of you might have listened to the fabulous podcast I did with Sally, who's an OT from the Fine Motor Flip book. And she talked about how occupational therapy is making occupation part of occupational therapy is about thinking about making sensory purposeful. Like, what is the purpose of sitting? So that's why it's important to observe where the child actually needs to sit. We don't just teach sitting for no reason. I want you to observe, how does a child need to learn to sit as part of their preschool family activities in their everyday life? And then sit in a car, for example. That's another way we sit. Like, think of all the ways a child needs to learn to sit with a seatbelt on. That's important, and that can be really hard. Some of the families listening will know the challenge of that compared to sitting in a chair, compared to sitting outside. So as I say, all very different. So let's decide that. then we need to teach it across a range of environments. And that's why we then need to find out from the speech therapist, what are the visuals or words that we're going to use for sit? Is it going to be using the sign for sit, or a board maker for sit? Compic's a very old system that I was talking about the other day and it just came to my mind. A board maker, a photo of the child sitting, of the actual child sitting, or any child. What are we going to use to support our language? Now, if you're using visuals in the early years, if you make a visual, make 10 of them. They need to be used across all environments. They need to be in your handbag, in your pocket, on a lanyard. They need to be everywhere. You can't just use them in one situation, because we want to transfer that. And that's why I'd recommend signing, because if everyone just uses the sign for sit, which is very funny, I'm doing it into the podcast like you can see me doing it. But as I always say, I treat these podcasts like we're sitting down for a conversation with a cup of coffee. So of course I'm using the sign. But it's just one hand on top of the other for sit. And you might want to put sit in the chair, sit on the floor, whatever you're doing, sit in the car seat. Remember, sitting looks different in different places. So we've chosen sitting, and we've got the OT, we've got the speech therapist, and maybe if you're going to a psychologist, find out how long can they sit for. I know they're 5, but are they more like a 3-year-old behaviourally? So how long do we expect a 3-year-old to sit compared to a 5-year-old? Well, a 3-year-old, probably 2 minutes, a 5-year-old, probably 5 minutes. So how long do we expect them to sit? How long do we expect them to sit on the mat? How long can they sit in the car before they try and pull out of that car seat? So have a think. Do they need something in their hands? How are they going to sit? How are we going to communicate sitting? Have a think about all these things. So we're going to choose sitting, and then waiting, and the same. Have a think. Are we going to use a sign, a visual? Are we going to give them something in their hands? Same questions. And then getting OT, speech and psychologist involved. And then as the teacher or the parent or the carer, how are we going to teach it and make sure we generalize it? And generalizing is make sure it transfers across settings, because many of my children will learn to sit at preschool but not do it at home. Many of my children learn to sit at home but not at preschool. So we need to transfer. Or they'll sit in the car but not in the bus. So how are we going to transfer that skill? Hope that makes sense. I know I'm talking really fast, but this is one of my passions in the early years. I hate seeing programs that have 100 goals on them. No, just 2. 2 is enough. We're just going to work on 2 goals at a time. And once they've got that, we'll add 2 more. Don't get me wrong, across the whole year, we'll probably end up doing 100. If we do 2 a week for 50 weeks, that's 100 things. But just work on 2 at a time. Last thing, and not least thing, but I would love you to create a WhatsApp group. And just the WhatsApp, the privacy settings have changed in the last little while. So make sure you've got the privacy settings set so no one else can access it. So in that group, I want you to share your successes. Just on sitting. If you're just working on sitting, let's just share about sitting. And take a photo of the child sitting so people can see. Or if you're using the sign, make a little video so you can share it with grandparents, carers, all the key people in the child's life so they know what sitting looks like. Or if they've got the seatbelt on in the car and some weighted thing in their hands, show a photo so people remember what that looks like. So when grandpa takes the child out, they know what to do too. And I find this fabulous. Not only are we just sharing our 1 or 2 goals, we're sharing our successes, and that's all we're communicating about. Now, if you're a speechy or an OT and you're going, Sue, that would just fill my inbox. No, you can turn on notifications or turn them off, and you can just look at them once a week before you talk to the families or Zoom with the families, however you communicate. But for me, it keeps everyone consistent and persistent. I have found over the years that parents find it fabulous to have those to refer back to if it's a visual of how we're introducing a sign. It's a much better way. Often at a session, parents have a lot on. They're thinking about getting home. They've got another child. Having that there, normally both partners don't come to a session. So having a little video, okay, here's what we're doing. Here's a video of me and the child. You can do it all in your session. Okay, I will stop. I know I'm a little bit excited, but can I tell you, I see the difference when we just work on 2 things. I see the difference when everyone communicates through something like WhatsApp. I see the difference for the child because world isn't so confusing and there's not so many different expectations and things are clearer. and I see progress. And I am into progress, not perfection. If you haven't heard me say that before, one of my favorite sayings. My daughter in year 12 this year, I bought her a drink bottle about progress, not perfection. I'm driving my family mad with that. But look, it's progress. And what I find when we see progress, we keep our energy up. When we feel like we're not getting anywhere, and when we've got too many goals, we get overwhelmed. It's easy to focus on what we haven't done. But if people are sharing their successes, like they sat for 5 minutes today, that is so exciting. So I would love you to consider that. Now, once we've set our realistic goals and you've got my book and you've photocopied or chosen a couple of goals, just work on those and email me if you want any help. But I recommend you just highlight which strategies you're doing from the book, because it'll have something like what I'm about to talk about, which is teaching a child to point. And then it'll have why we teach it and how to promote it. But then you can just highlight the 2 things you're doing and make a little video showing the child doing that or you modeling it, whichever way. So why have I chosen pointing and asking for help? Because for me, if a child is hearing impaired, and in my master's, I did hearing impairment, and gosh, I used to be a really good signer, and I used to be really good with Braille too, but they're 2 skills that I haven't used as much in my, now I'm main focus is autism. But when I did a whole lot of stuff on hearing impairment, what I learned was that children with autism don't develop the rich gesture that hearing impaired children do. So a child who is deaf or hearing impaired naturally learns to point with their eyes or their fingers or develops rich gesture. They develop that. But children with autism don't naturally develop it. And this is a huge problem. See, if I, just while don't do it if you're driving, but I want you to think, if I said to you, can you, doing charades, for example, or if I said to you, okay, we're going to do not talking in the staff room, you would all start using pointing, gesturing. If I said, where's your green hat, you'd naturally sort of do your hands in the air for where, or green, you'd look for something green and point to it, and hat, you'd touch your head. Children with autism don't develop that, in my experience. Autistic children don't develop this rich gesture. So they don't learn to point. They don't learn to ask for help. Instead, you get behavior. So that's why I would always start with pointing and help, because so many of my children do not have a non-verbal means of communicating. How frustrating would that be? So for me, non-verbal children will lead you or drag you to things. And many of you have had this where they just grab you and pull you. And you need to teach them to point or ask for help, because normally that's what they want. And very young children with autism are very strong and they can hurt you. They'll drag you through things to the things they want. And parents, what you learn is to go through a whole list. And in the beginning, it was probably the bottom thing on the list. But as they get older, it's the first thing on the list. You get good at predicting. Hey, sorry to interrupt. Sue here. Are you looking for one book with over 500 strategies to use in the early years with what to teach, how to teach, why to teach? Everything from teaching a child to cut and paste to tips for toileting, through the key foundation skills that children need to learn. The book I've written with Gay Von Ness, who won an Order of Australia medal for her work in the early years, is full of practical strategies to make a difference to you and the kids that you know. You could spend hours looking on Pinterest or Google or 100 different places for what to do, but these are proven strategies that Gay and I have both used in a range of settings. Gay worked in homes with families, in preschools, in schools. I've obviously worked in schools and preschools, and we've put in this book all the things that we used every day when we were going into those settings. I would love you to have a look at my book, The Early Years, The Foundation Skills, and these skills are helpful for many neurodiverse children, not just children who have a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. I know it'll make a difference to you and the kids you know. Please be aware it's spiral bound, because the whole aim is that you pick it up, use it, and it's practical. I would love to see it dog-eared and open and closed 1,000 times. Please let me know if you're looking for anything else that's not in that book, but have a look at the contents page. My guess is we cover everything in that book, from even how to choose a school to, anyway, so many great tips and ideas to make a difference to you and the kids you know. But that isn't helpful for people who don't know the child. As many of you have heard me talk about my beautiful Michael, who was the first child with autism I taught 30 years ago. He was nonverbal, but he made noises. I just didn't know what those noises meant. His grandma knew what they meant, but he didn't have any gesture. He either cried, made noises, which I didn't understand and I feel terrible about, but I had 25 children in my class. Once I had a class of 8 nonverbal children, and I got used to all their noises and I knew what the noises meant. But for if you're in a busy preschool or even your house, if a child can't communicate, how frustrating for them and for you. But my guess is you get good at predicting, like Michael's nonna was. She knew exactly what he wanted. I just didn't know. So it's important they learn to communicate for people who don't know them. So what I'd recommend, let's just start with teaching pointing. I would model pointing wherever possible. So say your child wants barbecue shapes, you just coactively put your hand over theirs, point with their finger to the barbecue shapes. Okay? And then they want the barbecue shapes opened. Well, don't cut them open or open them for them. Then use the sign for help, which is like 2 hands crossed over asking for help. Yes? Or if they're using PEX, which is picture exchange, the same. Give you the picture of the barbecue shapes or point to the picture of the barbecue shape, hand that to you. And if they need help, have a visual for help they need to hand to you, or the scissors to ask for the scissors to cut it, or open, But help is a very general term and very helpful for so many of my kids. But the thing about pointing is when I first started in autism, before picture exchange communication, I'm sounding old now. When I first started in autism, sorry, you might be sick of hearing that, but it's important to remember how far we've come. So we used to have visuals and children would just point to the visual, but there wouldn't be anyone there. And some of my kids would just stim. They would just tap, 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 tap the photo and wouldn't actually know what the photo was. They could have been tapping anything. They weren't actually looking at the picture. They were just tapping that spot, wanting a response. So that's why now we get the child to take the picture off and bring it to someone. So communication has to be done to someone. So I've got kids who'll stand there and point to something, but no one's around. So it's important that when you teach them to point, you teach them to either tap you on the arm or look, make sure there's someone there. Like, not look in your eyes, I'm not into that, but look in your general direction. And people on the spectrum tell us hair, ears, forehead, chin, but sort of point and then give it towards somebody, the barbecue shapes to somebody. So I hope that makes sense. This is hard on a podcast, but yeah, make sure that they are actually interacting with someone. And then wait. Remember, give them time to process that they've actually pointed before you actually then open it or give it to them. So, because even though a child is nonverbal, they still need time to process. So don't just point and then give it to them. Just point to it with them coactively and then maybe count to 3, then give it to them. But just play with that waiting, because in communication there's a waiting. I say something, you say something, they say something, So communication does have little pauses. It's important they understand that. Then once they've learnt to point to the barbecue shapes, I'm going to have 2 things. So I might have barbecue shapes and tiny teddies, or I might have barbecue shapes and an apple, depending on the child's ability to make choices. I wouldn't have 2 things they love at first. I would have something they love and something they don't like. I like to start with food because normally they're very motivated, but also food normally happens a few times a day. So in the morning, you might show Wheat Bix and Nutri-Grain. You might show an apple drink or milk, water or apple juice. Now, you might be going, Sue, they don't drink apple juice. That's the point. If you've got to have something they like and something they don't like, so they have to choose to point, because they need to learn to choose to know what to point to. Otherwise, they're going to be dragging you around and you won't know what they want because they don't know how to indicate what they want. I hope that makes sense. So making sure that they can point and make a choice. Those 2 things go together. So that's why I'd start with things I know they love. Now, the problem with pointing, that requires a lot of fine motor skills, being able to squash your fingers in. Like, try it now, even if you're driving, you can think you've got to be able to point, to pull your fingers in. And that's why dragging people is quite easy, but learning to point. So learning to point, you'll need to do lots of fine motor skills. Lots of my children aren't actually very good at that thumb finger movement. So doing lots of those little activities, lots of little songs that require pointing, you can do, or reading a big book and getting them to point to their animals. There's so many things you can do, but think about pointing, and imagine for a whole week, you just practice on pointing. You will be amazed how many opportunities there will be to model or mold a child's hand to pointing to things. Like one of my mums was like, oh, he's not really motivated by anything. I said, doesn't he love the bath? Yes. Well, get him to point to the plug. Don't just put the plug in, get him to close the door. He loved car keys too. So get him and keys to the house. Take the key out of the door so he has to point to the key. Just think of opportunities. Where can you create pointing? There are so many opportunities in every day where a child can learn to point. And then learning to ask for help, for assistance of other people, because so many of my children drag a chair open the door. So many of my kids, just cry when they want something because they know you'll come over and work it out. So every time the child grabs your arm or hand to try and pull you, just pause and clearly say or sign, help. You want help. Sue wants help. Sue wants help to open the door. Sue wants help. Yes? Help. Now, again, make sure you have a little pause and maybe get them to model their hands over hands or the visual. Make lots of visuals if you're using photos. Some of my children are best with a photo of the sign for help I've found over the years, so that hand over hand help, but take a photo because the board maker doesn't always make sense to them. But also when they're asking for help, they need to be doing that to someone too. So remember, you need them to be actually doing that help to somebody. Now, what you might want to build up over time is you take them to someone else for help. So they learn, let's go and ask Jason for help. Let's go and ask Chloe for help. And I'd encourage them to ask their peers for help or their siblings for help. This is a very important skill, asking people for help. And then you can go with them. Now, I don't want them to have a tantrum or a behavior meltdown because of anxiety. So you're going to have to choose the right activities to ask for help, how quickly you give them something, because if they're already anxious wanting something, that wouldn't be my time to take them to someone else. But please make sure you verbalize, help, and then get them to help you with things. Help mummy open this, help mummy do this, like actually asking them for help. Are there things they can do? I had a little boy who used to love doing up shoelaces, looking back a little bit OCD, but James liked to help do shoelaces. So the other children would go to James and ask him for help and do the sign and point to their shoelace, yes? Or I had another little boy who was amazing at puzzles. So children would go to him and ask, help Aiden with the puzzle. So remember, help goes two ways. So where can they help you? I had a little boy, Robin, who loved to put out the rubbish. So he would help with the rubbish. So how can you introduce help for them to get help and them to help you or others? So help is a two-way thing, remember? Same with the pointing. You need to be modeling pointing too. So they are two things that I would love you to think about working on. But please remember, if you allow your child to pull you without prompting any language, they will continue to do that. I have seen 18-year-olds still dragging people by the wrist, still screaming when they want help. You must work on this. And this is why I'm saying just work on it for a whole week. Persist and consistency on this one. So I would love you to have a look at my early years book. If you are in Canberra, years ago, they bought that early years book for every preschool. So go and look in your cupboards. They were like, this is just what we need for all our preschools. So have a look in your cupboards. I think it might be there. If you want to know more about the early years, I do have my early years course, and it is NESA interim accredited for those of you in New South Wales, TQI for those in ACT. My early years course is full of so many practical strategies for neurodiverse kids. It's not specifically for children with autism because so many children aren't diagnosed. It's for any of your kids who think or engage differently. It really talks about how to engage them in your program, how to support children with limited communication. It's like amazing course. I'll make sure I put the flyer at the bottom of the course. I'm just making a note to myself. Sorry if that text noise is amazing. It's annoying. I mean, not annoying. Sorry if that noise was annoying, but the course is amazing, and I just want to make sure you know about it if you don't already know about it. My only other thing today was to just remind you that many of my children need help with play, that they don't learn to play in the same way as their peers. And when I was at the autism school, we used a thing called play schedules. And if you look on my website, I have a CD with a whole lot of different play schedules, but I've also got some sample play schedules. So I'll include them on the podcast and blog page, because I would love you to try the play schedules, particularly if you're teaching turn taking. It's great to put a photo of who's doing which bit of like adding on a train, taking the train round the train set, because teaching play is such an important skill. Children learn so much through play, but many of my children aren't accessing your full play-based curriculum. So just to summarize today, just choose 2 goals at a time. Make sure everybody is communicating what those goals are and how they are going to persist and be consistent. I recommend something like WhatsApp, where you can all share the information to make sure every parent, carer, every program's, like if they're in a play group and an early childhood program, everybody's on the same page, so we don't confuse each other or the child. There's like over 100 things that you can choose from my early years book, but up to you. I would start with something like pointing and help, or sitting and waiting. If your child already has those skills, then you might think about doing toilet timing, not toilet training. Make sure you listen to my podcast on that. Or you might be thinking, gosh, 6 months we start school. We better start on cutting and pasting, or we better start on drawing, and in the early years book, we've got these little how to draw a house, how to draw a person, because so many of my children don't know where to start. And those little books are amazing. Laminate them, cut them up, spiral bound them. Can I tell you, all the kids love those books, but my ASD kids love them and neurodiverse kids love them, because they show them step by step how to draw something. And so many of my children don't go through those developmental stages, of drawing a person, where children just draw the head and the legs and arms and they go through those stages. Many of my children just scribble. They do not know how to problem solve that. So just a reminder, children on the spectrum learn and engage differently, and we have to teach differently too. Best of luck. Hope you've got some good ideas, and please let me know if you're looking for anything in the early years that I can help you with. If you're looking for more tips and strategies and want to learn with me and do a deep dive into lots of strategies for the early years, my early years course you can do online on demand at any time. It's a 5-hour course. It's accredited in New South Wales and ACT, but for all of you, it meets all the standards for your professional development. Now, lots of people have said, look, I love online on demand, Sue, but I like doing things live, and I get that. So I've got a live virtual coming up. A number of you did the course in May, and thank you. That was such a fabulous day. We had a great time. But a lot of people told me, Sue, we couldn't get released. We can't get a day out. So what I've done, I'm doing the same course over 2 afternoons from 4 till 7. Now, I made a mistake because I made it on a Wednesday. I surveyed people and they said a Wednesday was best. The mistake, I forgot daylight savings was going to be over. So it's 4 till 7 Sydney time. Okay, so for those of you in Queensland, that means it'll be 3 till 6. But even if you just jump on, even if you miss the first little bit, you can jump on and there'll be a replay, so you'll be able to watch that. Or I know sometimes when I was doing my free ones, often I'd see the kids in the background are on their phones. I don't mind, as long as you're there ready to learn. And with it's exactly the same course as the online on demand, just split over 2 afternoons. And it'll be from 4 till 7 Sydney time on the Wednesday, the 23rd and the 30th of October. Okay, so if you prefer live virtual on Zoom, make sure you register ASAP. There's $50 off at the moment, so register to get that special price, and then I can send out to you your show bag for the day, which has lollies and sensory tools and highlighters and notebooks and lots of fun things to make your learning fun. I hope you can join me. And as always, if you found this podcast helpful, please share with other people, because people don't know this podcast necessarily exists without people sharing. So I really appreciate you being a listener. And I would so love it if you could do me a favor and share this podcast with anyone you know with a child in the early years who's looking for some practical strategies, where to start, what to do, how to support children learn best who are neurodiverse. Thanks so much.